Well, guys, brethren, gentlemen, today is July, I think it's 16th?
17th.
17th. July 17th, 2008.
In the year of our Lord.
In the year of our Lord, 2008. This is Greg Johnson, and this is Robert Millet. And we won't do any other introduction other than to say we've invited them to discuss some deep and important things with each other, and we'll spend the next hour or two together doing so. So, gentlemen, why don't you begin by talking about how you came to your current deepest beliefs, religious beliefs, since you're both religious men. Tell some of the experiences that tested and strengthened your views, maybe early on in your life. Tell how you got to believe what you believe in. I'll let you decide who goes first.
Well, I was raised as a Latter-day Saint, but we were not active in any particular church when I was very young. My father was on the road a lot and was an entertainer, and so I didn't see him much. My mother was Methodist, but she was not a churchgoer. But we did say grace over meals. I did have friends who went to Catholic and Baptist churches, but from the earliest years, I didn't have a religious belief so much. I did say prayers. For some reason, I knew that you should say your prayers at night, and I would say I first learned, now I lay me down to sleep. But even as the years passed, even when we weren't churchgoers, I began to pray. And I think by the time I was 7 or 8, maybe 9, I began to sense that there was something real there, that there was a presence of a magnificent power, some mighty force somewhere that we call God. I would have been void of any, like I said, theological understanding. If you had said, what's God like? I would just say, I don't know. He's the one I talk to at night when I kneel down to pray. What was your experience?
Well, I rehearse my own life journey in a lot of different ways, and prayer in many ways. I think about how God has revealed himself to me, and I feel sobered at times, knowing where I've come from and the circumstances of my early childhood and some of the changes that have taken place in my life that have me persuaded that God has had a hand in my life and really directed me and guided me. And what were the ingredients to that? What kind of added to that was that, I was born into an irreligious home. I was born out of wedlock. My mother and father did not marry. It was a wounding time for my mom. She had 3 children with her first husband. Then she had a child out of wedlock, and here she was, an uneducated woman from Ohio living in California with now 4 small children. In my earliest days, my mom had a cancer, uterus cancer. I was born with some significant difficulties in terms of my skin condition as a baby. Was very troubling, very difficult for her. And so her life was very hard in many ways. She was alone out here. She'd never passed the 10th grade in her own education. She had no religious background outside of some Lutheran background as a child, going to church from Christmas to Easter type thing. When she was introduced... Did she speak much of her Lutheran well, this is
family?
not too much. In fact, this kind of is the foundation or the precursor to my own understanding of things. But through Mormon missionaries that came to her door in North Hollywood, California, because an older couple, a senior couple, had invited us kids to church, knowing that she had to work on Sundays at a restaurant. She was a waitress. And they asked her if they could, they would be happy to take the 4 children to church. And about 3 or 4 weeks into that, she found out that they were Mormons, and we were going to a Mormon church. This is, late 1960s. Well, the one thing my mom knew in her mind, from her perspective and her being raised in Ohio, was that whatever Mormons were, they weren't Christians. They had some very odd practices, and they did scary things, and they were, people to be shunned and feared. So she was terrified that her kids, through the kindness of this senior citizen couple, were going to the Mormon church. And she talked to a friend of hers at church, at her work. And her name was Shirley, and she said, "Shirley, what am I to do? These very nice people are taking my kids to the Mormon church, and I'm really troubled by that." And she said, "Well, why is that so troubling?" She said, "Well, the Mormons, they have these really strange beliefs, and they're not Christians, and they're a cult." And she said, "Well, do you think I have scary beliefs, and that I'm an intimidating person or whatever?" And she said, "No." And she said, "Well, Claudette, I'm a Mormon." Well, that kind of just challenged my mom pretty significantly, because she really liked Shirley. She was a very nice older friend of hers. And so the next thing she knew, she was taking the Mormon missionary lessons. And she went through the extended version way back when. And my mom, being uneducated, was at the same time impressive in that she knew she was not making a decision for herself alone. But she was really making a decision for 4 other human beings. And that by her decision, she was going to be directing these 4 children into a belief system about God. And she was very nervous about making that decision. It's one thing to make it for herself, but now to make it for these 4 kids, because they'd be raised in this religion. Was this the right thing to do? And after the first series of discussions, which lasted quite a long time, she told the missionary she was not convinced and could not join the LDS faith. 6 months later, they knocked on the door, and we were just revisiting, and she agreed a second time to go through those extended lessons. And the year was 1969. She had what I believe authentically was some kind of spiritual experience. And the question for someone like me is, where did that spiritual experience come from? At the time, my mom, the night before those missionaries were to come back, and having asked several weeks in a row, "Would you be willing to be baptized? Are you ready to make this decision?" She'd been reading through the Book of Mormon, she'd been praying, she'd been asking, but she wasn't sure. Somehow she was just pondering all these things. She went to bed, she was restless, she was struggling with what she was going to tell the missionaries. She laid down, we were all asleep, she says, and I've heard her tell this story, and I do believe it's a very authentic experience again. I'll get to the interpretation in a minute, but basically, she said as soon as she laid her head on her pillow and turned out the lights, pondering these questions in her head, being restless, that in a closed-door room with no open window, a very clear brush of wind from one side of the room to the other came over her and brushed up over her to where literally from her vantage point, the curtains blew out from the window and the windows were closed. It was startling to her. It was something that was...
Was she frightened?
Yes, immediately. She says, I was immediately frightened, and then almost within about 4 seconds, it turned from sheer fear and terror to a sense of calm and peace. And she just had to get her bearings. She had no idea what had just happened, but she literally got up out of the bed, turned the lights on, looked around the room, checked the window, checked the door, went out into the hallway, realized that we were all fine, and then she was trying to ponder, what in the world did this happen? And as she thought and thought and thought, she literally believed that this was a message from God to join the Mormon church. So when the missionaries came the next morning, she was anxious, literally. Let me tell you what happened to me last night. They confirmed to her that it was a message from God of affirmation.
Do you see, when I hear that, I think of, did she sort of interpret it as a movement of the Spirit?
Yeah, a kind of the Spirit. Yeah, blowing? Exactly. The Spirit was confirming to her that this was the right thing to do. Now, you know where I'm at today, so I'll just jump in here with a little bit of a question that I've had to wrestle with. Not just now at 41 years of age, but throughout my last 26 years as an evangelical. What happened in that room that night? If I'm to believe my mother's testimony that something physically did take place, did we make a terrible mistake, or did I make a terrible mistake when I left the Mormon church? Was that really a message from God, or was that not? I would say that ultimately I've decided it wasn't a messenger from God. That whatever it was, I don't think good epistemology is always developed around an experience per se by itself.
Although that's certainly what happened to 3,000 people on the day of Pentecost.
Well, they heard a message, though. They heard a message that did resonate with them, sure, but there was a message of truth proclaimed. I think even of the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus walking with their beloved Savior. Their hearts burned within them. There certainly was an experience. There certainly was something warm and just overwhelming to them. But as they consulted with and interacted with Jesus, and ultimately as he revealed himself to him as who he was, I think fact and faith are blended together well.
But don't you, looking back on your life, though, try to be as objective as you can. Don't you see your years within the LDS faith as laying a very strong foundation for you morally and religiously?
Oh, no doubt, no doubt.
In terms of kind of life to live?
Lifestyle, passion, convincement, absolutely. And there are times, and you know this, we've talked quite a bit, and we've been before others, I give great recognition and great credit to the person I am today in terms of some of the better qualities to my early formation and my early training. There's no doubt about it. And in that regard, while I have chosen to disagree with fundamental tenets of the Mormon doctrine, I can be not only appreciative of the faith and appreciative of the people, but I can take seriously the value that has come from that experience and from those situations.
It's not inconceivable to you then that God could have had you and your family tread that path for several years.
For some reason. Even if it didn't turn out to be to remain a Mormon. Well, I'll refer to my Nauvoo experience, which that happened just in 2005, and I think there might be something to that. Because either that night a deceptive false spirit blew over my mom to get her to do something that she should not have done, or it was a true spirit that told her to do something that she should have done, and which she ended up doing, or it was a figment of her imagination, that it never really happened, but she just assumed it happened. So there's only so many options that we can draw from what happened that night. Something happened that convinced one woman and her to join in the LDS faith, and her 4 children followed. Either it really did happen and it was from God, it really didn't happen and it was not from God, or it really did happen and it wasn't from God, or it didn't happen. And so you got to come down on something, and your comment is well taken. It could have been that God led me and my family into Mormonism for a specific reason, knowing that I'm no longer a Mormon. It could have been that was, you would have to recognize just as honestly as you asked me to consider that she was deceived. Maybe that was a deceiving spirit.
It's certainly possible that wasn't an experience from God.
Yeah, and certainly false spirits can, as an angel of light, in 1 Corinthians we're told that the devil appears as an angel of light. He can try to communicate to us about important decisions in ways that are not correct. Makes sin look very good at times, and people think they're doing good stuff, and so it could have been a false spirit, or like I said, it could have been something she imagined. But the circumstances of all that is, and I know I do a lot of precursor here, is that she joined the Mormon Church in 1969. She, my sister, my 2 brothers all joined the faith. Christmas Eve, 1969, they were baptized in Southern California. I had to wait 5 years because I was only 3 years old at the time to the age of 8 when I was baptized, which I was in 1975. And I would say the experience between 3 and 5, those 3 and 8, those 5 years, those formative years, were very, very significant years. Mormonism provided me a community. Mormonism provided me male role models. There were men in the church that invited my brothers and I onto father-son outings and campouts and different experiences that I was very grateful for. I had spiritual formation, moral formation, like the things that you were talking about. And I can be very grateful for those experiences. My mom remarried when I was 8 years old, and that was her second husband, and he was an LDS man, and he moved us from Southern California to Fort Collins, Colorado. And again, for the purposes of our conversation here, I know, and it just like with the experience with my mom that we just talked about, there are ways to interpret experiences. There are different ways to experience them, and the faithful might see it one way, the unbelieving will see it a completely different way. We have examples of that kind of stuff. You might see some of the miraculous nature of the Book of Mormon's translation to give you great reason to believe it, while others would say, I think that's just made up nonsense, Mm-hmm. So I know that the experiences that I had as a child, need to be evaluated. Because I chose to do what I did doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right.
Well, what's odd in my situation as I look back on it now, I really need to write this up because I think I'd understand it better. But what I find myself realizing as we talk about it is that like I said, there was no theology, there was no doctrine associated with my beliefs. It was experiential. It was.
Would you have called them Mormon beliefs at the time, knowing that you're?
I would say early on, it's just kind of theistic beliefs. It's
just God beliefs
in a supreme being.
Okay.
If
would you have related it to the Christian God, i.e., the God of the Bible?
It was because by the time I was around 5, we moved to Nashville, Tennessee. We didn't know if there was an LDS church in the area, so the only church I had was I went to a vacation Bible school.
Okay.
And so, to be honest with you, the first formal teaching that I can think I can conceive of having would have been in a Baptist setting.
Okay.
So that with me, it was experiential. I sensed there was a God. I was singing songs about Jesus, and maybe this is just the pietistic dimension of things, but frankly, that's how I came to it. I came to faith through experiences. I came to faith through praying, and sensing that I wasn't just talking to the ceiling, even as a little kid.
Right.
I came to faith by hearing lessons about Jesus that I didn't know much about, but since they were telling me the truth.
Right.
And even so that when I move into my older years and we become active Latter-day Saints, practicing.
At what time did that happen?
That would have been when I was about 9 or 10. By then, my mother, who'd been Methodist all these years, but had for some time now been going to church with Dad, she just simply said, I want to join the LDS church. And Dad said, I don't want to pressure you. This is your decision. She said, no, I feel more comfortable with the Mormon people. Now for Mom, I think seriously, if you went to her and asked her, why did you? She'd say, and this is not a poor reflection, she'd say, I didn't feel comfortable in the Methodist church. It was older people. I never saw anybody my age.
It wasn't because she read the Book of Mormon and was convinced.
In fact, I don't think Mom has read the Book of Mormon. She's in her 80s. But I think, in her case, it was a social. It was
sure.
In the best way. It was a communal. It was a communal thing. She said, I felt like I wanted to go, not just and be with your dad. I enjoyed the people.
Yeah.
Which to her meant they were good people, and they gave me a sense that we were heading somewhere.
Well, I think as you talk about faith, as you talk about religious convictions or worldview or whatever is the dynamic of that, we are talking about a blending of faith and reason. At least I want to suggest that both of those things need to be brought together. God has given us a heart and a head. I think if you attach the emotive nature of humanity to a heart and the intellectual sense to the head, you have to put head and heart together, if you will, to embrace the notion of true faith.
Well, that didn't begin to happen to me really in any serious way until I went on a mission, because that's when I found myself studying the missionary lessons and turning to my companion and saying, did you know we believe this? And he said, yeah, I knew that. I said, well, I didn't know that. This is cool.
Well, see, I mean, listening to these stories as we're talking side by side, you had an experiential knowledge or growth in generic Christian faith, and it gets affiliated with Mormonism through
channeled into Mormonism because Mom and Dad become active in it.
Not again because it was the conviction of truth that brought you to that.
Nor do I recall any kind of conversion type experience.
Like I want to leave this and become that.
No,
I was just you were just continuing on.
It's kind of a gradual movement into activity in the faith, because that's where Mom and Dad went.
Which is, again, the opposite is my mom makes a dramatic decision, a very thoughtful and quote-unquote experiential decision to embrace the Mormon faith, feeling like she really wants to make sure she's making the right decision so she leads her children well. We embrace the Mormon faith. 5 years later, she gets remarried, moves us to Fort Collins, Colorado, and in moving us, I will tell you that prior to my baptism at age 8, and through my baptism years, my early years in Mormonism, 9, 10, 11, 12, up into being made an Aaronic deacon in the Aaronic priesthood, unlike my older two brothers, unlike my older sister who had a little, maybe they were 4 or 5 years older, I took to Mormonism like a duck took to water. I was the zealot young boy. I was faithful to my meetings. I enjoyed it. I don't remember a lot of that time prior to moving to Fort Collins, but certainly in my Fort Collins years, by the time I was 8, turning 9, my mid to late elementary years.
Why did you like it? I'm interested. What is it that you felt made it enjoyable for you? Because that makes the question of your leaving it even more interesting.
Absolutely. You know what it was? Because Mormonism made a very profound claim. And from my earliest years, I can recall believing with a certain sense of, honestly how I looked at it, a certain sense of pride that I was a part of the one true church upon the face of the earth. For me, that phrase was known in my 2nd grade, 3rd grade time period. When I thought about being a Mormon, I thought about being the only true Christian. I thought about being on the inside of the only... It was like I felt very motivated by that, very excited about that, and I wanted to convince people to become Mormons. Even in my elementary years, my early junior high years, if we could go back magically in time, I'm telling you, if we could see a videotape of me talking with my friends, I was always inviting my friends to primary. I was always inviting my friends eventually to mutual. I was trying to bring them to my church. I had a strong view that they were wrong and I was right. There was a passion about that. And it's interesting, to what did I associate that? Was it just moral rightness? Was it spiritual rightness? Was it, something about the Joseph Smith story itself?
You must have felt something that you would describe as spiritually fulfilling or motivating.
I think that's a fair question, and I'm trying to respond with honesty here, but I think my sense of being... because you know something that I've said since then in relationship to what happened to me at a biblical camp, at a Christian camp for youth in my 8th grade year. I very much enjoyed the community. I very much enjoyed the activities, going to meetings, going to Sunday school. Paying my tithing was a big thing. I always, if I was from a relatively poor family, and I might get $1 for a job that I did around the home, and I remember saying, "Gosh, a dime is hardly anything compared to what I got." And I enjoyed putting a single dime into a tithing envelope and giving it to the bishop on Sunday and saying, "Here's my tithing," or whoever I gave it to. I'm not saying that I didn't get that we were talking about Jesus Christ but there was a pride in my believing that I was a part of this. I mean, I knew the Joseph Smith story. I understood what he went through. I understand the Book of Mormon. I can remember Rex Pinnaker, one of the general authorities, came to Fort Collins and challenged us. I would have been probably 10 or 11 years old, to use the old paperback version of the Book of Mormon with the angel Moroni on the front, the blue cover. And for whatever reason, he made the suggestion. He said that to give yourself the sense of accomplishment, get one of these old paperbacks, read a page and rip it out, and it'll help you to finish the Book of Mormon. And I remember being so challenged by that I got one of those, and I did that from beginning. That was the first time at age about 10 or 11 that I read from cover to cover the Book of Mormon. I was very motivated. I'm not sure that I was motivated to read the book or to get the content or study it so much as I was to get through it, because I was very task-oriented and very, very award-driven, by accomplishing it, by getting recognition. I can remember being so excited to get my little Articles of Faith sticker buttons that you'd put on when you'd memorized one. And Mormonism provided an environment for me to achieve, to get to that. I remember becoming a member of the Aaronic priesthood, how excited I was, and to take it seriously, to make it seriously. I was the youngest of 3 brothers, so I was picked on terribly by some non-religious brothers, by the way, and I knew enough about the Book of Mormon, that the story of Nephi and his older brothers, that someday when I got that priesthood,
you really identified with that.
I was going to use it. I was going to use it against Steve and Mike next time they come after me.
Shock them.
Yeah, exactly. They'll be falling backwards. And so, I want to say that I was a true believer I mean, I knew the stories. I understood what we were about. My recollection of the first leader of the Mormon Church, even though it was Spencer W. Kimball. I came on a temple tour or a conference tour in that period of time. Probably it was I was still in Fort Collins, so I was probably in 6th or 7th grade, and we came over to Salt Lake City. I remember sitting in the upper balcony of the tabernacle and looking out as I was so excited. And when Spencer W. Kimball came out on the platform, I was totally taken. If I would to refer to that as a spiritual experience, I'd say it was deeply moving to me to see the prophet and to know in my mind that is the only man on this planet that has a personal audience or privilege of audience with Heavenly Father, that he can speak directly mano y mano to God, And so I will tell you, and then shortly thereafter, I had an experience of doing baptismal work for the dead in the Manti Temple, baptizing my dead grandfather, my dead uncle, several dead relatives. In fact, Bob, I had brought so many names to be baptized in our temple tour trip. We didn't have a temple in Colorado at the time. I brought so many, and I had outdone everybody in my group, that they came to me, and I was so angry at this. They came to me and they said, "You have a lot, and some people only have a few. We need to give some of your names."
Share some of yours with them.
And I wouldn't, and they made me. And I said, "Well, you're not taking my grandfather, you're not taking my uncle, because I'm doing them." The peripheral people that I don't know well, I'll share a few of them. But I was really disappointed because I had done that work, and I almost want to say that I felt that I was helping my ancestors come to the Mormon church, the true church.
Let me ask you this. Did you not find at a certain point people... here's what began to happen to me as I began to move into teenage years. It's so easy to be a hard-headed knothead as a teenager and not pay attention. But for some reason, I admired older people.
Yeah.
And I used to remember in testimony meetings we
Right.
held where these older people would stand up and bear their testimony,
Yes.
share their faith. How moving that was
Yes.
to me. Here's this woman, 89 years old, that would
Right.
get up and say, "I remember when I joined the church as a young 16-year-old, and this is what the church has meant to me." And so I think the other thing that proved very, very foundational for me was watching, observing, admiring the lives of solid, steady, faithful,
I would agree.
God-trusting people.
I would agree. I would agree, and then let's bring some closure to this. But I kind of have a part two to all of what we've been talking about so far, in that something began to happen in our home that certainly tested the reality of Mormonism, and that test came in the conflict between my mom and my stepdad. My stepdad was supposedly a good Mormon. They'd both been divorced, so they had to be married civilly, and then they were going to be married in the temple a year later. And I often ask myself, because I have to acknowledge the importance of experience, but had my stepdad been a different kind of Mormon...
We may have been having a different kind of conversation.
Absolutely. But I would like to believe that truth reigns above our experiences. So I actually believe that regardless of how my stepdad was, it's not him to blame for this course of life that I've taken. But because of the conflict, after a year's time of being married, my mom was wanting to go to the temple and have their temple made in a temple marriage, and he was not willing to give up some habits of his that prevented him from going to the temple. So this conflict begins, and the first year of their marriage was pretty decent. The next 3 or 4 were terrible, and it ended in 6 years. By the time we left Fort Collins, I was the only member of my family. My Mormon sister had married in the temple in Salt Lake, was living in Provo, and her husband was attending BYU. My 2 older brothers were inactive for the most part because they didn't like going to church. And I was the only one. I was going without my dad, who was inactive at this point, my stepdad, I would say, and my mom. She was very disenchanted because of the conflict. And by the time we leave Fort Collins, at the end of the middle of my 7th grade year, we go down to Littleton, Colorado, and for the next year and a half, I begin a new experience in the Mormon church, one that is tainted by the conflict in my home. I realize that, but one where, for some reason, I immediately go to the Mormon church in Littleton, Colorado, and I do not connect with any of the youth. I do not connect with the people. If we'd gone back to Fort Collins, being that I was this kid that was going to church all the time by myself, near the last year or so of my life there, I was kind of the ward orphan. I'd literally be taken to church by a priesthood leader. I'd go to priesthood meeting. I'd go to Sunday school. I'd go to and then we'd break because we was the two-tier system or the double meeting system. And I'd go home with a Mormon family, eat supper with them, and spend the whole afternoon with them, and then come back to sacrament meeting, and then somebody would take me home. And I was given great affirmation. I mean, people knew my family. They knew me, and they were very affirming of me that I was coming when I didn't have that support system. And so, again, I will say that I was a pretty serious, young-minded boy of believing in these things. What happens then that changes all that for me? Well, in Littleton, Colorado, on the heels of not connecting well with my local Mormon ward for whatever reason, and the conflict in my home, a Baptist friend reaches out to me, a little guy named Eric. And Eric invites me to his church. And I figured, well, the people at my ward aren't so friendly, so I'll go there. Now, I'm a good Mormon. I don't think that this is a beginning of a compromise. In fact, I said to myself, I know I'm still a member of the One True Church, but they're not very friendly, and my mom and dad aren't going, so I'll go with Eric. And Eric was like a substitute. But something happens in that experience for me in the middle of my 7th grade year to the end of my 8th grade year, and that is that I find a new community of very friendly people. I connect very well with the youth pastor, a guy named Pastor Mike, and yet all that changes when he comes to a Sunday school class not realizing that I'm a faithful Mormon kid, and he gives a talk about how Mormons aren't Christians. And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe he'd say we weren't Christians. And I went up afterwards and I said, Mike, I want you to know, I do come to your group because Eric's my friend, and I like coming here, but I'm not coming here ever again. He said, why? I said, because I'm a Mormon and I'm a Christian. I can't believe that you would say I'm not a Christian. So he asked if we could talk, and he and I sat together at the Littleton Public Library. He shared with me some anti-Mormon literature. I thought it was a joke. I didn't know how to respond to it necessarily, and I remember getting a stack of stuff from him, and the first thing I did when I got home, even though I was attending their church, I threw it right in the garbage. I didn't want to read a single word of it. I thought it was all from the devil. Eventually then, Eric invites me to the summer camp experience, which is in the summer of 1980. And even though I've had this experience, I'm willing to go. Bob, in that week, something happened to me that is, I would say, experiential in the same way that I brought the illustration of my mom's experience. But I would say it was experience with a new kind of element. And the element there was that they had a Bible lesson twice a day that we went to. The Word of God, the Bible, which as you know is so dear to me to this very day, that in reading the Bible, in my quiet times as they instructed us, and going to a chapel where I heard the Bible preached, I heard about something I'd never heard before. Some of my other friends, when they talked about their faith, they didn't talk about being a Baptist. They didn't talk about their religion. They talked about being a Christian. They talked about Jesus. When they prayed, they said, "Dear Jesus." I never prayed that way. I prayed more formally. I believed my church was correct, and I always saw my identification with God as based in being a part of the right organization. So this really challenged me. And by the end of that week, and through a little song experience that I heard several times about who killed Jesus, I found myself asking myself for the first time, why do I think my church is right and all their churches are wrong? When I'm around them, I'm more impressed with their spirituality than I am with my own. Why does it seem like they know Jesus and I just know about him?
We need to draw this to a close. But
let me just say that I think we're on a filet mignon here, and so we don't need to draw it to a close. If you'd like to continue this discussion, don't feel. The only reason I said this will be edited out.
Okay.
The only reason I said 5 minutes was I wanted to let you know that it had gone on 25 minutes, and it was extremely interesting. And you guys, this is, if anything, this would be fabulous family history. You guys ought to put this in your own archives because this is very interesting stories for both of you. But you're on the turning point of your conversion.
Yeah.
You kind of had your theistic thing with Mormonism.
Yeah.
You had your theistic thing. Now you're getting specific to your commitment.
And to some degree,
and I want to get to your specific commitment.
You really, that happens on your mission, it appears.
But let's go from that camp story, where he gave us some very good experiences there. Do you want to amplify that anymore? What happened after or during or after?
Yeah, let me just wrap that up.
And then Bob could come in and tell us his story.
Because as we talk about experiences, I'm convinced Hebrews 11:6 is a good text of Scripture to support this, that without faith it is impossible to please God, and those that come to Him must believe that He is. Now, like I said, here I had the right stuff in my understanding of things. I was a member of the priesthood. I'd gone to the temple and did baptism for the dead. I'd gone to General Conference and saw Spencer W. Kimball. All that stuff was in my portfolio. I go to this camp where there's these lesser Christians, these Christians who weren't as spiritual as I was. But Bob, the way they sang about God, the way they sang about Jesus, the way they talked about Him, the way they prayed to Him, I felt that they had a relationship and I had a religion. They had something that but it was different, and I was startled by that. I was troubled by that. I won't go into the song, but that song about who killed Jesus, that was a chorus. That was it the Roman soldiers? Was it Pontius Pilate? Was it the Hebrew children that rejected Him? And when it came to the end of that little chorus, and it said, "Who killed Jesus? I would like to know. Who is guilty of a crime so low? Why did He have to die? What is the reason why? Who killed Jesus? I would like to know." And the final verse of that chorus says, "When I think of Jesus and the way He died, how upon Him all my sin was laid. All the other people fade away from view. It's for me the sacrifice was made. I am guilty. Now it's plain to see that it was really me." I'm telling you, the first several times I heard that little chorus in those chapel sessions, I said, this is the most ridiculous chorus I've ever heard. I wasn't even alive 2,000 years ago. I had nothing to do with the death of Jesus Christ. I did not kill Him. Those Roman soldiers put those nails in His hands. The Pontius Pilate turned his back when he could have stopped it. The Jewish people rejected Him. Of course, those are the guilty ones. And here I was, now a 14-year, maybe 13, 14-year young boy who felt I had all the right stuff. But that song, by the end of the week, convinced me that if Jesus Christ had to come to die for one person and one person only, if it was only me that had ever sinned, He'd have still come. He'd have still endured all that He endured. I believed His sacrifice was intimately personal. And I would say the difference between the little boy that went to that camp and the little boy that came away from that camp was that the little boy that went felt that God revealed Himself in a particular religion and that He saved the world. But that little boy that came out of that camp was convinced that Jesus Christ died for me personally.
I'm not a cynic and I'm not a skeptic, and so I'm not prone to doubt the validity of what you've described. But if I were,
okay, fair enough.
You know that I would come back with the question, and how can we know this? But it's certainly worth talking about. What if your stepdad was
a good faithful Mormon?
A good faithful Mormon. What if, in fact, you had clicked with the kids in that second
in Littleton?
Then
I think those are very valid questions.
Game, in some ways, you and I have talked about over the years how interesting it is. You tend religiously to go where you're brought up.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact of the matter, you ask a Catholic kid, "Why are you a Catholic?" Because my family was Catholic.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for most everybody.
That sociology is very true.
But you see, as a skeptic, I might say, and I'm not. I don't doubt the veracity of your experience, but you could see where I could say, "Gosh, Greg, your mother had a bad experience, not so much with Mormonism, but with the person who wouldn't live it."
Yeah, yeah.
And so she just gave up.
Yeah. And felt as a Mormon woman, she had very little recourse. I mean, it was through her Mormon husband that she was going to receive exaltation.
That's right.
And if he wasn't going, she wasn't going.
What the heck? Yeah.
And it broke her heart. And I want you to know that as I leave that camp, I'm heading into 8th grade. I go immediately to my Mormon bishop in the Littleton ward. I have 2 different meetings with him. I will tell you that experiences versus actual truth claims and truth responses. I appealed to this bishop in these 2 meetings over several important questions about who is God, who is Jesus, how to have a relationship with Him, and he was not adequately prepared to answer my questions, and it was a frustration for him and a frustration for me. And basically, he just said, "You're supposed to believe this stuff." His response to my questions was, "I don't know the answer to your questions, but don't ask those questions because just believe this is the true church." So that whole year was a time of transition, and I do eventually decide in the latter part of my 8th grade year with my mom to officially leave the Mormon Church. I write a letter to the LDS Church, and I say I have that letter in my possession to this day. It's not well written. It's not well thought out. It's written in the hand of an 8th grader, and I said that I wanted to have Jesus Christ the number one thing in my life, and at this time I don't feel that I want to be anything other than just a simple Christian. And so I made that decision. I actually went to a bishop's court back then by myself, a 14-year-old boy in front of a bishop and a first and second counselor. The word of that second counselor, I don't recall his name, but he did say, in kind of a healthy, honest, skeptical way, like you were just, making comment to. He said, "Greg, I believe that you're a remarkably sincere young man, that you're going through something that is very real to you. Obviously, I disagree with what you're doing. I think it's wrong, and I think you're making a mistake. But I want you to know," and I don't know if you want to call it a prophecy or just a statement of hope or whatever, but he said, "I believe that within 10 years, you're going to be back in this church as a result of leaving it, and that you're going to be a more faithful Mormon, and you're going to be used in some mighty way to do something great."
But see, he just missed it by a couple of decades. Clearly, by the time you're 44, the prophecy will be fulfilled.
Catch this, because this speaks to the experience issue. For the next 10 years, between 14 and literally into my seminary days, when I'm 24 years old, back in Denver, Colorado, getting my master's degree, preparing to be a pastor in Utah, I went back to my ward because those words haunted me for those 10 years. I wondered, what if he's right? Maybe I'll go back. Maybe I'm going to figure out I've been wrong. Maybe I've been off on a tangent here. And going to Christian high school, going to Christian college, now I'm heading into seminary, fairly convinced that Mormonism is doctrinally in error, and wanting to give my life, if you will, to helping other Mormon people whom I didn't hate and never wanted to be considered an anti-Mormon to. But I wanted to help them understand that what I discovered back at that camp was that you can't have a right relationship with God without knowing His Son Jesus personally and intimately. And if you put anything above that, a church, an affiliation, an effort, a works righteousness thing, then you're going to miss it. And so I'm prepared. But for those 10 years, I am always thinking in the back of my mind, am I going to go back to the Mormon church? Is there something to that? Where am I going? I had always thought about that. And on the 10th anniversary of my departure from Mormonism, I went back to that same Littleton ward house. Nobody knew me, and nobody knew that I was there in some spiritual journey. But I sat there and I said, "Okay, God." I haven't been so specific about this with you in the past, but I said, "Okay, God, here I am. If this is right, and the last 10 years has been some journey aside for some reason to come back, I'm sitting here. You got about an hour to convince me." And maybe I was going in a wrong spirit or something, but I kind of went with that mentality that if they're right and if Mormonism is true, I'm here. Let some speaker say something, let some person say something, let some experience happen. Otherwise, I'm going to be relieved of this feeling that I've been carrying for the last 10 years, and I'm going to move forward being convinced as I think I am. And so, that journey for me, walking on from that day, obviously nothing did happen. I'm sitting here as an evangelical Christian and deeply in love with Mormon people, but deeply persuaded that there are doctrinal problems within the system, and wanting people like you, my dear friend, to see it my way or see it God's way. As I joke with you, there's only two opinions. There's the way you see things. I missed it, but there's the way I see it, the way you see it, and the way God sees it, but He sees it my way. No.
That isn't working because it makes no sense.
Yeah. All right. My dad has that joke.
We get the point.
Yeah, get the point. So,
in my case, it was, I don't think I took, I felt things before. I felt things as a young man. And it was beyond just the people, and it was beyond just the admiration of noble souls. There were times when singing hymns, I really felt something. I think one of the first things I ever felt was the hymn, "I Stand All Amazed." Oh, it is wonderful that He should care for me enough to die for me. When I felt the reality of that, but I don't know that I took any effort to put intellectual structure around my feelings until the mission. And it really was when I was in the mission about 5 months that I first encountered anti-Mormonism. I'd grown up among Baptists and Catholics, but they're just in my area. No one was doing anti-Mormonism. I never heard anything. Ours was a different group, but we weren't considered non-Christian. But
You weren't ever persecuted or made fun of or anything?
Never, it's the oddest thing when people say, "Did you really have a rough upbringing?" Not really. Not really. All of my friends were very religious kids, Methodists, mostly Southern Baptists and Roman Catholics.
Where were you raised?
In Louisiana. And you would have thought that people would say, well, no, so you're a Mormon? They didn't know what that was. All they knew is something about Brigham Young and pioneers and stuff.
Okay.
They didn't know anything about Joseph Smith or whatever. No, I never faced that, and never faced it until anti-Mormonism on the mission, when a whole community was prepared to receive us, as it were, and just gave us piles of material. This was in Tenafly, New Jersey. They just piled it on, and we took it all home and put it in the corner and stacked it up, and we thought it was quite a trophy. And then I began to look at it, began to read it. And there arose a particular doctrinal question, something that seemed inconsistent within Mormon teaching. I couldn't answer it. My senior companion couldn't answer it. And we struggled, and we struggled, and we struggled. And I think we both had reached a similar point where it was really eating at us. Because I don't remember a lot about the question, but I know it was serious enough to where it was affecting me, and whether I felt I could continue to testify of something that I was uncertain about.
Do you remember the nature of the doctrinal issue?
It was
at
on
all?
the Godhead.
Okay.
I remember it was on the Godhead. But I wrestled with it and wrestled with it. I prayed. I mean, this is a true confession moment, but I don't think I ever prayed about the truthfulness of any of my beliefs. And maybe that was because my mom and dad were so convinced, and the people I admired were so convinced. But I think you could say that I had never formally had a personal spiritual experience in terms of an affirmation, a spiritual witness, or a conversion experience that I could point to and say, yes, it happened when. I don't think that happened until the mission. But after reaching the point where I was sort of up against the wall spiritually, where I found myself saying to God, I either need to get an answer to this question or I'm going home. I can't be a hypocrite about this. And then one day, making a very long story short, sitting down, close to tears, at lunch while my partner's making lunch, I'm just sitting there. And I remember just feeling so low and reaching over and grabbing the pamphlet that I had read 40 times. Joseph Smith tells his own story. And I just read the first paragraph. And not unlike what your mother experienced, but without the wind, I had the most calming, settling, affirming, confirming feeling experience in the next 4 or 5 minutes that I'd ever had in my life. I didn't hear any voices, but the feeling, the generalized feeling, was one of course it's true. But the other feeling that came was even more interesting. The other feeling was a feeling of my head was not yet ready to wrestle with the answer to that question, but would eventually have an answer. But go ahead, move on. That was enough for me then. Within a matter of 2 months, perhaps, I changed companions. I raised the question with him, and in 2 minutes he had answered the question very easily. And so in that sense, my head had caught up with my heart. And so for me, that was one of the first real traumatizing crisis spiritual moments in my life. And I've had a ton of them since then. But they are often, and I find this to be true, they've often been in my life at crisis moments. And by crisis, I don't mean horrible things necessarily, but where you need an answer, where what you know is not enough, where my piddly knowledge, my piddly experience is just so puny.
You're kind of at the end of your leash.
I'm at the end of my leash. As I say, I'm up against the wall.
Yeah.
And so my experience was one from kind of a theistic orientation to a generalized Christian orientation to a growth into Mormonism, and then a challenge to Mormonism, and then a reaffirmation of Mormonism.
Huh.
I would take it a step farther and say this. I think my growth into Christ has been the most recent. That would be within the last 20 years. It isn't that I didn't believe in him. It isn't that I didn't know he was the Savior. It isn't that I didn't believe the New Testament.
Right.
But it was the sense, the reality, the hard reality of recognition of my limitations, recognition of his perfections, awareness that I can never make spiritual progress without him.
But what's challenging for me at that level, knowing a little bit about that time period, we met 11 years ago, so 10 years prior to that, you began to kind of sense something.
Well, I can remember the first time I proposed a paper for a conference on grace, because that was 1980, and so it's the first effort to say there's something to this doctrine that I'd heard all my life from Billy Graham and Jimmy Swaggart and others and from my friends, but that I've not entertained a great deal in my experience.
And certainly had to, I think you've mentioned this, and again, it's my experience, your experience, whatever, but there was something that you felt was needed to progress in your relationship with God.
I felt I had plateaued spiritually and that there was something missing.
I can recall one of the most significant things you said to me, because you came to visit me when I was pastoring at an Orem church, the Evangelical Free Church there. You came to visit our congregation. It was one of the first things you and I had the opportunity to do when I came down to Orem. I don't know if I was preaching or not. But you sat there and went through the service, and we talked afterwards, and you said it was a nice service and you were complimentary, but you told a story of a Methodist friend or some friend of yours that you had gone, you shared another experience of attending a church, and that he was weeping in that service, and you said, as you looked over at him, it just challenged you to think, there's something to that man's beliefs.
They were very deep. They were very deep, clearly, and I had no idea that he felt as deeply about his faith as I felt. If I were being totally honest, it's proud, but if I were being honest, I'd say nobody feels as deeply about their faith as I feel.
Right.
But I'm looking over at my friend. We're in this beautiful cathedral-like structure, and he's weeping through the presentation, and the feeling was a great discovery moment. It was a discovery.
And what was that discovery?
The discovery was the awareness of God's love for him, God's love for humanity,
could I say
God's movement in his life.
His work outside of Mormonism?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think that was a key moment, and I remember that so well. Those kinds of moments. Reading Billy Graham's autobiography and having this feeling of, wow, what a life.
Right.
Sensing God had taken this North Carolina preacher and made him a powerful instrument in his hand. Those were great moments for me because they were broadening experiences, and I considered them to be a very significant part of my spiritual growth, because it's one thing to be committed to your faith, it's another thing to be broad enough to recognize and to be humble enough to recognize God is working in paths far broader, far more reaching than you had any idea before.
Brothers, that's been a great exchange, by the way.
We're not going to do that again. I mean, we'll go brief.
No.
He's going to say, "Oops, the table's off. Can you do it again?"
I told you that question is a zinger.
Yeah.
It's always a great question if people will go with it and relax, and you did.
Well, in my case, you know what's good for me?
I hope you actually learned something a little new about each other.
I learned something about me because it caused me to think back. When we weren't active in the church, what was I believing? You know what I'm saying?
Generic Christianity.
It was generic Christianity. generic Christianity.
It's section 10 of the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah, my church.
My church.
No, I think there's something
1828, by the way. Joseph Smith says, I do not say this to injure my church. What church is he talking about?
But to build up my church.
What church is he talking about in 1828? There's no Mormon church that exists.
Right.
So anyway, I think...
I was trying to do a little side conversion over there.
No, that's
swide persuasive,ness. He just set me... Yes, very good. Next question.
I will go back in and check your dates.
Well, this is his...
I was the one that discovered it.
No, yeah, that's very interesting.
It is.
So we have an 1828.
Well, an 1828 revelation where the Lord is saying to Joseph Smith in section 10, I've given you the Book of Mormon not to destroy the Bible, but to build it up. And then several verses later, and I am bringing my church, and I will restore my church, not to tear down my church, but to build it up.
Good.
He said, well, what is his church? I remember asking Andy Skinner that, and Andy said, it's got to be Christendom, Christianity. I said, that's all it can be.
Well, the book of, this is not my dialogue, but I would say that the Book of Mormon gives us warrant for the humble followers.
Yep.
That are beyond Christianity even.
That's correct.
The Mormon doctrine of the Spirit of Christ being given to all men.
Or the passage...
And that's just not a Mormon doctrine. You know, the Protestant and Catholics have a doctrine of the faithful beyond Christianity.
Well, what they would call kind of a generalized grace or a common grace.
Yeah, natural grace
common
or
grace.
common grace.
Yeah.
And then or the natural revelation to all mankind. And so that's...
Let's go to another question.
Okay. Any
That was lengthy. We'll be less lengthy, but that was enjoyable. It caused me to think back. What was I believing in?
Yeah.
Well, because I don't remember Mom or Dad ever teaching me anything other than I ought to say my prayers.
Well, fellas, from a social psychological standpoint, I can just tell you both have very similar lives in that your parents were only indirectly formative.
Yeah.
It's almost your parents kind of, I'm not going to say this, they didn't let you down, but they didn't really push you too far.
We had to be self-motivated.
You had to find your own way.
I didn't get my gospel training.
Yeah.
He didn't get his gospel training from parents.
Right. That's interesting.
There were influential others, but most of my searching, frankly, was on my own. I think yours was probably the same, was it not?
I was going to say, one thing I don't know about your story, and it was generated in your sharing. When you leave Tennessee to come back to Baton Rouge, your dad leaves the Grand Ole Opry to become a radio guy, right?
That is correct.
That's what motivates him to come home.
Dad says this is no life. Dad had toured the country for 3 years. Says this is no life for a family. My sister's born about that time. My younger sister. And even then,
is that when he revs up his commitment to his Mormon faith?
Not yet. It's not until his father dies. That would have been in 52. It's not until 1954 when Dad's father dies, and it's the first time I'd ever seen my dad weep.
He takes his Mormonism seriously.
He felt so guilty, and he felt pained that he had let his father down, who had been our LDS pioneer in Louisiana, because when his dad died, we were not active in the church.
So 54, and you're born in what year?
47. So I'm trying to keep track of the years. I don't know where I am.
You're only 7.
I'm 7 or 8 at that point.
Yeah.
I think Mom is baptized and I'm baptized when I'm about 9.
Okay. So at what point does the Book of Mormon and Mormon theology take root for you? I mean, do you read the Book of Mormon as a young boy?
No.
You become a member of the priesthood, right?
You became Bible stories.
You become an Aaronic. You go through the Aaronic priesthood and all that stuff.
Back then, Greg, as you've heard me tell thousands of people, the church was not a scripturally based institution. We had our scriptures.
You carried them everywhere you went.
You didn't take them to church.
Okay.
You took your manuals to church.
Okay, you just followed the manual.
And so I didn't really become scripturally based, including the Book of Mormon, until a mission, but especially after a mission.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Question.
Here's our question. If God has the power to communicate truth to mankind, why doesn't God make the same truth clear and obvious to everyone in every place in all periods of time? God might not force everyone to follow the true path, but why doesn't God at least give everyone the same true map?
Let me charge into that one first. I think that is one of the most compelling questions, the question of why, if I feel so strongly about what I have, why, if you go to your knees and pray about it, you don't feel the same thing?
Exactly. When we ask in all sincerity that we know that we might have it, and are willing, if God should tell me in some way that I'm wrong, I will go where He tells me to go.
You were there, but we were in a conference that we held at BYU on authority, and Roger Olson, a very prominent evangelical scholar from Baylor, he specifically says, I've got to tell you, I've read the Book of Mormon. I have prayed about the Book of Mormon. I didn't get a witness that it's true.
Right.
So I do think this, Greg, I think the tendency, the temptation is to jump too quickly to, yes, we believe in absolute truths. Both of us do.
Right.
But the tendency is to jump too quickly toward one must be false and the other true.
Right.
In other words, that we could go that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would be the easier path. But I'm not sure it's the most productive one, because it really gets at the harder question of, that really doesn't answer the question, because the question is, if God loves all His children, and if evangelicalism is the way to go, why don't I feel myself compelled to go that way? Why don't I find God telling me, Bob, join with the evangelicals?
Right.
They've got it right. And maybe I'm more of a mind now to say, I don't have a bit of difficulty believing that God can reveal some of His truth here, and some of His truth there, and some of His truth there. I think C.S. Lewis believed that. He said, God, by His invisible influences, is working upon the hearts of men and women, bringing them to Christianity, or closer to Christianity, he would say, than they have any idea. Now, so I think I'll begin by just saying, it would be easy enough to say, well, He's not revealing to you that Mormonism's true, because it's not. He's not revealing to me that evangelicalism is the way to go, because it's not the way to go. That's certainly an option.
Yeah.
That's an option. But I think that's the easy option. I think the harder option is it conceivable that he could have Greg Johnson just where he wants Greg Johnson to be, and Bob Millet just where he wants Bob Millet to be, for the time being. Yeah. And that in His divine purposes and His mysterious ways that we can't understand, perhaps we're doing just what He would have us do at this moment in time. Now, that I don't mean that to sound either liberal or escapist. I'm not trying to escape from the problem. I'm trying to say, I've thought about this a lot. Why would anybody? I mean, to me, it was so simple as a missionary. You pray about it, you get a testimony. But I've worked with people who've prayed about it for 10 years.
Yeah, and with that simplistic way of thinking, anybody who doesn't pray and get the same answer,
they're not sincere.
They're not sincere. They've got sin in their life. They're not spiritual. Right. Whatever. You just dismiss all those.
And that was easy for me to take as a position before.
Yeah.
But I don't take that position now, because I find myself saying, no, I think she's earnest. I think she really wants to know. And I don't know why she doesn't know like I know. And so what I find myself believing is, people are at different stages, and I don't mean less than, greater than. I don't mean higher and lower necessarily. I mean different avenues of life. It's
kind of more like a pie than it is a line.
Or a puzzle.
Yeah.
Where the puzzle piece.
And you got part of your puzzle done, and I got part of my puzzle done.
Well, yeah. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously, just like you said, I have wrestled with epistemology. Really what that means is, how do we know what we know is really true? How do we know that the commitments we've made in life, the values, the beliefs, the ideas, how do we know they're true? And if I'm persuaded that I am living the truth, that I am following, as Jesus said, the way, the life, and the truth, in John 14:6, how do I know that I'm doing that? I sat with a young man on Monday of this week and presented the gospel to him and asked him to consider becoming a Christian, which he and his girlfriend did, and they prayed a prayer and they pledged their life. And I spent a good deal of time talking with them in advance of that decision, that you can't start a belief in Christianity with full and perfect knowledge. I'm not going to try to convince you that you can. But there is enough believable and I believe verifiable information to make it a reasonable and rational decision.
So that not all, from your perspective, we can't answer all the questions, but we can point you to enough evidences for
that is more plausible than alternatives. And so I know that, again, as we talk about epistemology, we can't say that I've exhausted the known universe's knowledge of all religious truth claims, and I have examined them effectively and efficiently, and therefore I know without a doubt, I've examined every document, I've had every personal experience, I've studied the history, I know the literature, I've read every religious piece of literature equally faithfully. I haven't. I haven't read the Quran. I haven't studied any document like I've studied the Bible. I have read portions of the Quran. I have read portions of other literature. I have looked at their worldview as a system, and I've embraced Christianity. My toughest course in college was not Intro to Philosophy, which is, people walk out with their head spinning, wondering if they really exist. My toughest class, because I was a sociology major, was the sociology of religion. You start studying the social demographics of this country and this world, and you say, well, there's a perfectly good reason why a Muslim's a Muslim. There's a perfectly good reason why a Jew's a Jew and a Lutheran's a Lutheran and a Catholic's a Catholic, because 95% of the time, where you're born and to what family you're born into is usually what you be. What you end up being. And that really messed up with my head, because I thought, am I an evangelical Christian because I had this experience out of Mormonism and immediately identified with evangelicals, and that's why I'm other people are equally convinced who are Catholic, Lutherans, Presbyterians, whatever, and I went through the whole list. So in this larger question, I think we have to be very committed to the priority of both study. Scripture commands study to show thyself approved. The Bereans are complimented in Acts chapter 17 for examining the Scriptures and comparing what the disciples said to the text of Scripture and letting that be the guide. And if they were not in agreement with the Scriptures, they rejected the disciples. The Bible over and over tells us discern the spirits. There's an affirmation and an injunction to study and to know the truth. And Jesus says that He is the truth. That you can, He says, I am the truth. But with that reality, I am honest to say that we see through a glass dimly. 1 Corinthians 13 tells us we don't know everything. And so I have to look at your experience and my experience. I have to look at the atheist experience, the Muslim experience, the Buddhist, the Hindu's experience. And I have to ask myself, in a honest and genuine process, why don't you see it my way? Why haven't I been able to convince more people? I certainly haven't. I certainly have desire to persuade more Latter-day Saints than I have ever been successful influencing.
Well, I've asked you. I've said to you, what would I do differently, Greg? And this was years ago.
Yeah, right.
We don't talk about this much anymore. But I remember saying to you, what if I wanted to have this special relationship with Jesus that you have? What would I do differently? You see what I'm saying?
Just come as you are. The buses will wait. Come down to the sawdust trail. No, I know, and what you and I have done in this very challenging, I think, but incredibly enriching and rewarding experience is to leave the result with God. And I can say that. I think John Stackhouse gives us that kind of injunction in Humble Apologetics, that in the end, I believe what I believe. I believe it through my study. I believe it through my experience. I believe it through my situations. I am encountering people all the time, and I hope that I'm humble enough and honest enough and vulnerable enough and authentic enough to say, if I have yet to learn something that might even radically alter my life, might give me a 180, am I willing, should God reveal to me something that I don't currently know, am I willing to go and seek the truth wherever I might find it?
Well, he goes so far as you're indicating, and this is, I remember circling this when I read it. He goes so far as to say, are you studying their faith enough to where you would make a change if you found them to be right.
Right.
Are you open?
Are you open enough to do that?
Are you open
Yeah.
enough to do that?
To give a serious consideration, if you will. And I think unless we are, we're really not having dialogue, we're having monologue. I'm just trying to persuade you because I'm right and you're wrong. But to do the study, to seek the truth and to come after the truth, the idea of then saying, okay, why doesn't God? I mean, again, simplistically, I can remember in our car conversation that time when we were discussing the future, I said, Bob, the only thing I have to know is that if God somehow revealed to you in an unquestionable way that God Himself at the end of your bedpost one night or spoke to you in the shower or knocked you over the head on some journey to BYU or something, if you knew without a doubt that God was telling you that Mormonism was false and that you needed to become an evangelical Christian, would you obey God? And you said yes. And I said to you that if I want to make the same commitment to you, that if God chooses in any way through this friendship, through other experiences, or through some discovery, that I am to return to my Mormon roots, or whatever it is that I'm supposed to go to, I will do it too. And so that's what made our relationship honest and, I hope, legitimate in that way. And so here we are, 11 years down the road as friends, traveling and speaking quite a bit. I don't. It's not my desire just to keep this gig going. I'm still desirous of you to see things my way, and we still talk about those things beyond the platform. We talk about it in the hallway. We talk about it in the elevator, at the restaurant, about certain aspects of theology, and I've been enriched by that, and I continue to go back to that same thing. God, whatever you want to accomplish in me, whatever you want to accomplish in Bob, whatever you accomplish through our friendship with other people, I am content to say, this I will leave with God.
Let me broaden this for a minute. Have you not been with people who are not Christian, who have a spiritual presence, a power about them that is evident? Have you had that experience?
Are you talking about other religious people
people outside Christianity? And because I think this, you see, we could stay within the realm of Christianity here, and we're still, the great truths to be known are. But where it really gets interesting is when I try to move you or you try to move me outside Christianity, and I say, have I been around? And my answer is yes. I've been around Jewish persons where there was just a glow about this man, where there was when he spoke as one having authority. He really did. And I say to myself, how do I explain that? Mm-hmm. How do I deal with the fact that this man, he's not, I don't sense in any way at all he's a deceiver. I don't sense that he's even deceived. Now, do I believe you need to believe in Jesus Christ? Yes, of course. But there's something about this man, perhaps because he's true to what he has, to his basic understanding that he does possess, that makes him unusually gifted, and it draws people to him. And again, I don't mean in some deceptive way. I mean in an inspiring way.
Yeah.
I watched him teach at Brigham Young University, Jerusalem. My goodness, what a charismatic man! And I use that word in the right sense of its meaning, not just what a wow popular guy. I'm talking about a guy that spoke with real authority, a rabbi.
I don't know that I think of immediately people outside of the Christian faith that I have admired in that way. Can I acknowledge that there are impressive thinkers and impressive people and good people even that are not Christians? I recognize that as the case. I don't know that I've ever had an experience that has caused me to kind of do the follow-up question that, this guy's not even a Christian and yet he's so spiritual. Maybe that will still happen. But
let's take it out of evangelicalism for that just for a second. We'll come back. Let me push you a little bit even in the Christian realm.
Okay.
What do you make of a Mother Teresa? I mean, clearly, this is a woman who is, in Catholicism, is about to be
made a saint.
Canonized. Made a saint. and she isn't just a person who lived in 600 that you and I. She's not like St. Francis. We can read about St. Francis, but we don't know a lot about him in the sense that she lived during our time.
Right.
What do you make of a woman of that?
Well, you see,
if you were to ask most Latter-day Saints, I'm asking you because I'm saying if you ask most Latter-day Saints, you might have a number of those who'd say, well, she's an awfully nice lady, but she didn't have the fullness of the gospel, so I don't know that she's going to go very high in the draft.
Yeah.
And so my comeback on that is, whoa, I think she's going to go really high in the draft.
Yeah.
Because this is a woman that's really into the true work of loving the way Jesus loved. But I'm interested in what you think.
No, I think it's a very fair question, and I have wrestled with, as it pertains to death of people outside of the Christian faith, people that famous people that you might know and acknowledge, and ask the question of, okay, we were pretty candid about this in a conversation, noting that the LDS prophet passed away this year. I had a pretty honest conversation about where do you think Gordon B. Hinckley is right now? Is he up there doing high fives with the preceding 14 prophets, or is he up there going, oops,
or is he down there?
Or is he down there going, oops, there are only so many realities to our understanding of spiritual faith and truth that we have to consider. Let me say it this way, that the thing is, I am so persuaded that one is made right with God not through personal achievement or personal effort or exterior spirituality or goodness. I think one is made right with God through that great exchange when they, in the humility and sincerity of their heart, cry out to God for forgiveness. So that do I understand there are more sincere Christians and more devoted Christians and more faithful Christians? Yes.
But I believe Teresa would have agreed with you 100% on that. I don't think she felt her salvation rested upon her good works.
Well, and if that's the case, and I know I haven't read her recent book, you have, about some of the struggles, that's actually comforting to me, because Mother Teresa is not going to go high in the draft because she spent her life in the gutters of Calcutta.
No, but if that work she did is in fact a manifestation
of sincere true faith in
Christ, which she has in her soul,
that's why she's going high.
That's right.
Not because she sacrificed in such a worldly, impressive way. Any more so, and this is the irony, is on the flip side, the thief on the cross, who cries out at the last moment, living a life of sin, deserving to be executed as a criminal, he cries out for the mercy of God, and I love these two words, grace and mercy. Grace, getting what I don't deserve. Mercy, not getting what I do deserve. He got grace and mercy. There's a lot of stuff that you and I deserve that we hope we don't get. There's a lot of stuff we know that we shouldn't get, and that's what the grace of God is. Come back to the question itself again for a second, though. While it's easy to ultimately epistemologically kind of just punt to, I don't know, God does know, and I'll let Him work all these details out. The reality of some of those sociological elements that I was talking about earlier, that you do certainly see a lot of that. Why are there so many Muslims in the Middle East? Because the Muslim faith is predominant there. Why are there so many Jews in Israel? Because, why are there so many evangelicals in the United States? Because, I ask God, why don't you reveal yourself more clearly? Why don't you give us that map? At least give everybody the same chance.
Or Bertrand Russell, what are you going to say to God when you see Him? Why didn't you provide more evidence for yourself?
Yeah. And ultimately, again, the Scripture gives us a great point there. Paul says in his epistles that we can trust in the justice and the fairness of God. And so I don't wrestle with all of the extracurricular kinds of questions as much to say that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and life. I want as many people in the world to know that. And I like how you and I both liked how Rabbi Zacharias once said it, a friend of ours, an evangelical leader. He said, it takes one level of faith to become a believer, another level of commitment, if you will, of belief commitment to be a member of a particular denomination, and a higher level still to end up becoming a preacher or a pastor within that given denomination. Or a theologian in that denomination. And at each of those levels, you have to make a firmer commitment. But generically speaking, my heart is for the world to know that Jesus Christ is true. I don't believe that's just my opinion. I don't believe that's just my persuasion. I believe that if you don't have Jesus Christ in your life by the time you die, you're going to spend eternity in hell, where the worm does not die and the flames do not quench.
Even if you never had the opportunity?
Even if you didn't have the opportunity.
Now, is this your Calvinism coming through?
No, because Romans 1 says that God's going to work it out. If it's an issue of sincerity, and God knew that you would have, had you gotten the information, am I going to be shocked to see someone there that I didn't think was supposed to get in? No, I'm going to say the justice of God was appropriately merited here, and God knew. Or, on the other hand, I always say, how do we know that those people who never heard, and I believe in an omniscient God, how do we know that had they all been given the equal opportunity to know God in the fullness, and He gave a 5-minute visual appearance and gave them ask me any question you want kind of deal, that they would have all turned around and rejected Him? I don't believe that I can love or be burdened for any member of the human family more than the great God and Creator who started all that is. So if there is a lost sheep in the fold of the world, believe me, He will go out and get that lost sheep. And every lost sheep that chooses not to return or not to accept the invitation of the shepherd, the great shepherd, they will deserve, because they, not God, they have rejected His love when He did everything possible to extend that love.
So you're saying, let me see if I can summarize. You're saying salvation comes only through Jesus Christ, even if a person didn't know of Jesus Christ, but God, knowing their heart, will judge them accordingly. And you sound like you're preaching great Mormonism.
No, I'm saying that in the end, I operate as one who thinks and lives my life on the first part of that, on the first part of your statement. That's how I live. That's why I believe in the call of the Great Commission. I believe we need to go and tell. It isn't just a matter of one's sincerity. And yet I ultimately defer so that I don't become a man who feels like I have the right and authority to judge all or outside of my personal knowledge and experience of Christian faith, because I do think God is fair and God is just.
Does He reveal Himself, though? Does God reveal Himself to people beyond the Christian faith? You would say yes through this common grace?
I believe in a common grace. I believe that there's, I think within the world, I think even outside of the Christian faith, those who believe in God, have an understanding of God, or a higher power, a higher being, are, if you will, like-minded with me in the pursuit of something beyond this natural realm. They are looking for the supernatural. I feel that they have responded to the general knowledge of God, but they have not come to the special knowledge of God, which is that God is uniquely revealed through Jesus Christ. But again, we're talking more about Christian conversion and how God works, and kind of moving away a little bit again from this revelation question is, why doesn't God give this equal knowledge? Why, if some people should choose to reject Jesus Christ, fine, but make sure that they all get the same amount of knowledge.
Maybe I'm rephrasing the question, but I am asking this. Who is to say that He is not revealing Himself to people, even though clearly from your perspective He's not giving to them the knowledge that you have? In other words,
well, that's where I ultimately punt to the fairness of God. If God, as a Christian who reads the Bible, I'm dedicated to the Bible being a rule and authority in my life. I can go as far as the Bible gives me parameters to go. So I do believe, as in the discussion of Romans chapter 1, 2, and 3, that God is going to work out the details. But that clearly, the message of Jesus Christ is you have to come under Him. No man can come to the Father but through Jesus Christ. No one can come unless God calls them. So Is
it conceivable in your mind that for an entire lifetime God could be gradually, line upon line, precept upon precept, preparing someone in this life to receive the message of Jesus Christ, but the man never receiving it in this life, but receiving it hereafter?
my tradition and my understanding of biblical scripture does not give much license to that hope. The idea that the Bible teaches that there's a time to be born and a time to die, and then comes judgment. There seems to be an urgency in the very life and ministry of the Apostle Paul to proclaim and to teach and to call people to.
Greg, the bulk of humanity will go to their graves without having heard the name, much less know the gospel.
Not just in our time, but over the last 2,000 years.
Yeah. So the bulk of humanity will be damned.
I can remember this coming home to me in being in the Middle East and being in a relationship with a Jewish person, not a Muslim person, but with a Jewish person, and asking them. We were looking in the kind of the model of Jerusalem. In Jerusalem there's that model of the ancient city of David. I mean, ancient Jerusalem, and you can look at it and see it all over. And I remember asking somebody something about Pilate. Where would have Pilate lived? And they said, well, who's Pilate? And I said, well, Pilate, the one who was the Roman governor. I don't know anything about Pilate. Well, Pilate, he was the one that he's the one that abandoned Jesus, and he was the governor, and he could have saved Jesus. Who's Jesus? I said, oh, come on, you know who Jesus is. He said, what do you mean Jesus? And I couldn't even convince this Jewish fellow. I mean, I just assumed. Yeah, I mean, it startled me enough to think, could there really be a person that would not know, let alone somebody in the jungles of New Guinea or something like that, who had never heard the name of Jesus. Bob, I can't answer that question of a humanity. I can't answer the question of the last 2,000 years. And that's again where I come back to the faithfulness of God, but where I don't feel any of us need abandon nor rest in any false assurance that God's going to work it out, and as long as people are sincere, they can go to heaven. That alternative is not left to me. I must be urgent. This is an urgent message. This is an urgent thing, because death and heaven and hell are awaiting us. And I feel super motivated by that.
I'm less troubled by that, because I agree with you about the urgency and the Great Commission. My question is how
can you be if there's post-mortem salvation and God's going to work it out, and most people are going to get to a better place anyways?
Because I want them to enjoy the blessings of the gospel as much and as early as possible. I want them to have joy in their life as soon as they can. That's why there's an urgency. I have to love humankind enough to want them to feel something of what I felt, and to feel that not.
Can you honestly be as concerned about a soul who, if they cross that threshold of death and don't believe and come under judgment and are going into the lake of fire, can you be equally concerned about that soul as you could be concerned about a soul just having a fuller knowledge or a richer knowledge? I think
probably not.
Hey, this is a desperate situation over here. This guy's going to walk into a flame of fire if he doesn't come to Christ.
It is, but that borders on the Reformed theology that I just can't buy, which is if they don't get the gospel, it's because they weren't intended to get the gospel. But let's get back to this question of knowledge.
Because even post-mortem salvation, as much as Mormons want to say they've kind of solved this one, or at least have a upper hand on this one, is the vast majority of the human soul doesn't even have a genealogical record to have their work done for them. They're lost to antiquity. There is no knowledge of their being, their name, their identity, their birthplace, their death. So you can't go out and baptize for someone that you never knew exists. And that poor soul gets to go where? Because he never got his work done for him. He's got to stay in paradise. You got to punt ultimately to the God will work it out in the end thing too, huh?
No question.
Yeah.
I believe God will work it out, but I think He'll work it out in the sense that He'll make it possible to happen.
But if all those people are going to get an opportunity beyond baptism for the dead or temple marriage for the dead, why then do all the temple work?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying a person will at least have an opportunity, a valid opportunity that only God can judge.
Yeah.
To know Christ and to know the fullness.
I think there is a Mormon doctrine, if I'm not incorrect, that during the millennium,
much of that will be revealed.
All those spirits will put their hand up and say, "You forgot me, George." Hey, Amy, over here.
Here's a name for you.
And so that during that period of time, that's the Mormon lore.
There's a good escape hatch there for all.
There's a great escape hatch. You got 1,000 years to work it out with people.
Maybe a way of closing this, and I want to close it because I want us to get on to other things. But let me ask you this: what do you make of the statement by our dear beloved friend Richard Mouw in his little book that's hard to read but fascinating. He shines in all that's fair.
Okay.
Which I guess is taken one of the great Christian hymns. But he says, when I read the Revelation of John, when I read Isaiah, and I hear figures like 10,000 times 10,000 worshiping and honoring and bowing
every
before the
tribe,
Lamb,
tongue,
from
kindred, nation.
Kindred, nation, tongue, and people. He said, I am forced to ask the question, is it possible? And I'm forced to wonder if what we call so often common grace perhaps couldn't be, in the long run, saving grace.
I have, I think, we have taken a long look. I've examined this, the different views of salvific theology, how salvation works in the Christian faith. Again, we're getting much more into soteriology than in epistemology, but the idea there that I basically have opted for a more conservative view, a more narrow view than Rich Mao, and I believe so much in the general revelation of God leading us to a knowledge of God, and the special revelation of God leading us to a personal relation with Jesus Christ. And I anchor that in Jesus' own statement that you must know about me. There's no way, there's no truth, there's no life, and anyone that comes to the Father must come through me. I believe that Jesus meant it. And so there is, I believe there is a defining line between those who do and those who don't go to heaven. There are sheep and there are goats.
But you're not going to stamp your foot on the other side and say, how did this happen? What are they doing here, when you see a whole bunch of people who have in fact come to Christ that you didn't think so?
Absolutely not. And you know that we dealt with this in a very real way. And I think this was one of the most unique things about the passing of our dear friend, a fellow colleagues of yours, who died, a faithful member of your faith, who was a pretty honest and transparent man, and who revealed some questions and some doubts he had in our association. But there he lied in his coffin with his temple garments on and his green apron. And I looked upon our friend, and I found myself sad and a little bit that that sacred thing, that the elements that were around him are things I don't believe in. I don't believe you have to be buried in your temple clothing and your apron and whatnot, and I don't believe in the necessity of temples and things like that. So I saw him as a sincere believer, but I knew him as a man, and I'd had talks with him about his faith in Christ, and his funeral service was an expression of that. And I remember in my own heart, I'm not betraying anything I've just said, but I'm giving application to the broader understanding of God's love and grace to say, God, I sure hope, and I want to believe, and it's not theologically hard for me to do so, that this man is my brother, and he's a Mormon. And if there are things that he needs to be told, he's probably finding that out now about certain commitments. But I did so not because I was getting soft on my theological idea. In fact, I think I was doing it because I understood and saw his heart in many different experiences where I think his love for Jesus was so like mine that it was persuasive to me to have a hope, not knowing for sure. But like you said, if I got to heaven and I saw this man there, I'd be thrilled.
You not only wouldn't be angry, you might not even be surprised.
I might not even be surprised.
I can hear Richard John Newhouse when he wrote, I guess I have to believe in hell because the scriptures tell you. He said, but I can always hope it's empty.
Yeah.
Well, I think you would... this is that last question is what, or comment in the exchange there, where you went, William James would say we all have religious temperaments. Mm-hmm. And I get the impression from you, Greg, that you find that people are just too wishy-washy if they go that way with their theology, and it screws up their lives, both in terms of how they commit themselves to God and act, And also the things they do in the world are wishy-washy. So I'm gathering that your sociology and psychology and practicality align with your theology there, and that's why you go conservative, because you think to go the other way is kind of dangerous.
It's a slippery slope.
It's a slippery slope.
The hard part is, what if they go that way and they don't live a wild and crazy life? What if, in fact, they live a very reverential life? What if they live you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Randy's saying is fair. We have to, in our own formation, our psychology, our theology, our sociology, we have to come up with some category to make life sensical, not logical and not nonsensical, Let me say that different. That to make it logical, that the categories fit and make sense and are cohesive and coherent.
Sure.
And I think that when you take the Bible at face value, there is a absolute truth claim that's stated there. And so I don't want to be guilty of in any way lightening or lessening some of the. I mean, when you read the parable, I mean, these are Jesus' words, not mine. When you read the parable of Lazarus and the rich man and the agony of that rich man, now on the other side of death, pleading one for just a dip of a finger of water on his lip. He's so in agony. And he cries out, and Abraham says, there is a great chasm between him, the man in life that was given nothing. He was a poor man. He was a beggar. You wouldn't even acknowledge him. Now he lives here in paradise. You live in agony in Hades. And this goes right to the epistemology question, frankly. I mean, why doesn't God give us this 5 minutes with God to convince the whole world that He's true? Abraham says something, Jesus says something in this parable that Abraham says, even the prophets came. But if God were to send His own Son, they wouldn't, even if the dead rose, he said, they wouldn't believe. Even if you came back from the grave, they would find reasons not to believe. So in a sense then, we don't know why people ultimately reject God or believe God. If you've had experiences, I certainly have, of devout, faithful brothers, kindred spirits who have walked with you in faith and knowledge and understanding, and later, or even while you're their friend, they walk away. They reject Jesus. I have a friend that has rejected Jesus Christ, who was a dear Christian brother of mine. How could you reject him? I've labored with him for hours and hours to remind him, to encourage him, to try to encourage him to come back. He's not there.
Closing thought, are you open to the possibility, then, that God could be revealing Himself in different manners and in different ways? Not different truths, but in different manners and different ways to different people. In other words,
I'm uncomfortable with that statement.
Well, the problem is it gets at the question we began with. Is it possible that God can be working through people who obviously from your perspective and from my perspective, the highest achievement is to receive Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, and He becomes the captain of your salvation. Is it not possible, though, that God could be working with people, leading them along, directing them, inspiring them in ways that we would wonder about, but that He is doing, to lead them toward that great aim? In other words,
by all means, there's a process to anybody arriving at that knowledge.
I'm getting back, and I'm sort of balking at the idea that people automatically jump to, that assume that why doesn't God reveal the same thing to everybody? Maybe that isn't the plan. In other words, maybe it isn't that everybody be of one complete mind at the same time.
Well, I have to challenge you a little bit on this. I mean, one might examine my psychology, my sociology, my personal experience and put me into a category. But where do I get this? I get this. And I was very drawn to it. I'm going to draw back on my Mormonism. There's a young man that wants to know which church he should join, and he prays and he seeks God, and once he becomes persuaded that God has spoken to him, he is willing to risk life, liberty, sacrifice, personal happiness, and endure all kinds of persecutions because God has said this thing. And that is admirable to me. That is attractive about Joseph Smith. That, ultimately I have to make a decision on whether that happened and whether it was a sincere thing. But you cannot deny the impressive nature of his commitment and what he committed to it.
Of his decision.
Very exclusive. Yeah. I mean, Bob, Mormonism of that period, I think, was very black or white. It's you're in or you're out. And I think in my personal Mormon experience, I was living at a time in the late 70s and early 80s where it was us versus the world still. And maybe my Mormonism transferred into an evangelical experience still convinces me that there is a truth, and that truth must be adhered to and followed and embraced. And again, I'll go one step further than Joseph Smith. Again, John 14:6 is such a compelling verse. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father but through me. Jesus doesn't seem to give us, path A, B, or C, maybe even D.
It isn't so much that I'm suggesting that he'll say, it's okay whatever path you take because we're all going to end up in Rome. No, there's certain parts of Rome I don't want to go to.
And certain paths don't take us to Rome.
That's right.
There's only one path that takes us to Rome.
I agree. The question is that I'm just challenging the very question by suggesting maybe God is doing more than most people suppose he is in terms of leading, directing, guiding, inspiring.
I think so. I can go that far. I can open myself to that reality that God is bigger than my circle, and that he's moving beyond my circle. And that's exciting to me in the sense that I do still believe that is to draw people unto Christ.
No question. Next question.
That was a very fine exchange, too.
You'll find that all of our exchanges are fine.
Still,
we're good at this.
He still has that young boy's pride, doesn't he? That Mormon pride.
I've been trying to get rid of it. I'm reading a book on humility right now.
All of our exchanges are fine.
I almost said it, but he didn't. I said, all you did is move from being a fundamentalist Mormon to being a fundamentalist evangelical.
or no, like what Lake Wobegon, everybody is, what is
above
it?
all
All
average.
The men are...
All the children are above average.
Oh, yeah, we're always above average.
All the men are handsome and all the children are above average.
Yep, that's it. Okay. How can you honestly respect and trust someone that you think is wrong about the very purpose of life and the best way to live?
Let's be briefer on these exchanges. The time is going. You know what? I don't think that there's two people, at least from our communities, that have to wrestle with this kind of question
more than you and I.
Because we are dearest of friends. We've traveled the world together. We've been in private moments and public moments. We've been in high-level meetings and private conversations, and we've done a lot of attempting to persuade one another. You've been very gracious to me. I hope I've been likewise to you. You've been very honest with me. We've achieved a level of transparency that I think is hard to beat in any human relationship that I know of. And yet you're where you're at, and I'm where I'm at, and I don't. I know this. I know that you would feel the same way. Is that I love you. I respect you. I deeply appreciate you. We've had wonderful experiences together. I was going to say I would die for you. I think as a friend, I would stand in front of a bullet for you. I mean, I would do. You could call me at any hour of the day, and yet, I don't know. Even though we share so much, I don't know in the same way that I would have confidence in my fellow evangelical Christian brother. Believe me, I think this is transparency too. I don't know that I have the confidence that you're going to be in heaven with me like I would know that I am confident that my wife Jill's going to be in heaven with me. There are things you're a unique Mormon in my mind, and so you say things and express things in ways that are very compelling to me to make me feel that they are very sincere and like-minded, and that your basic beliefs, even though you have some additional beliefs that I would not agree with, that your basic beliefs are kindred to my own. But ultimately, I don't have the ultimate confidence that you, like my wife Jill, because I am confident of her evangelical understanding of things, I wouldn't put you in the same category of Jill as I am absolutely confident. I'm highly hopeful. But even saying that, it does not deny my ability to respect your intellect, your sincerity, to be admiring of your openness and your transparency. And I think probably the richest part of our interfaith dialogue has been, beyond anything that we might be given any compliments for and encouragement for, is the richness of being able to look to somebody, look outside of someone, look at someone whose faith is different than my own, and be able to, yes, pray for you and hope that you're seeking God in the sincerest way possible, but ultimately to know that while God knows that and He's going to take care of that, that life is richer because I can know you and experience life together with someone outside of my tradition.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with what you just said. I would sort of distill it for me this way, and that is, respect for another person does not have to be on the basis of agreement.
I agree.
On that, I agree. Something as critical as eternal things.
Yep.
In other words, I can have tremendous respect for Pope John Paul II, or for Pope Benedict XVI, because of what they are, what they stand for, their intellect, and their intentions.
Yeah.
While I disagree with them on a number of things. And so, that's especially true when you have a friendship and a devoted friendship.
Those are easy, though. You and I are easy because of our relationship.
That's right.
But can you love and respect a fundamentalist Muslim? Can you love and respect an atheist? Can you love and respect a racist?
Yeah, that's tougher. That's tougher.
A racist can be a very nice person to his fellow race, The
respect, part of respect has to do, though, with an appreciation for one's attempt
to live out their
faith in a way that blesses mankind, blesses humanity.
So I'm not comfortable either.
I'm not going to have respect whether he's Muslim, Catholic, or Jewish,
someone who's destructive,
or Roman Catholic who destroys another life. I'm not going to have respect for that.
Yeah.
I will have respect for a Muslim who's true to his faith. The minute he moves beyond that to wanting to wipe out my family, that's another matter, and I don't have respect for that.
Right.
And so that's why I say respect is not a factor so much of similarity or unanimity on belief, as much as it is the admiration you might feel. There are people, there were many Democrats who had tremendous respect for Ronald Reagan.
Right.
They couldn't have disagreed with him more on political issues or social issues, but they believed him to be a man of integrity. They believed him to be a good man.
Yeah.
And that he was what he stood for. And I think I feel the same way. My respect for someone is built upon, yes, how well I know them, but also the extent to which they're trying as best they can, and I perceive they are, to be all they could be.
Yeah.
And whether it's exactly the same as mine, to me that's immaterial.
Interesting. Okay.
I would like to push you on that question just a moment.
Okay.
There's a slight difference between trust and respect. For example, you can trust somebody because they're competent, they have the right stuff.
You can trust an atheist physician to do a good surgery.
You can trust them, and they have the discipline to do what they say they're going to do, the moral rectitude to do what they say they're going to do. You can respect someone for trying to be good, but you're not going to trust them because they're either incompetent, they have the wrong beliefs, they're going to get everybody in trouble if they go down the road, if they pervasively, if the sincere atheist gets everyone to believe that there is no God.
I could have respect.
You see where I'm going, the difference in trust and respect?
Yes.
Can you trust somebody that you feel is deeply wrong about their religious or philosophical beliefs?
Here's a question.
Separate from respect.
When my father was a general manager of a radio station, one of his favorite and one of his best DJs was a Jehovah's Witness. We got to know that man, his wife, their children, and of course these are clean living people. These are people who live lives of discipline and devotion and to their cause. And so I felt then, and I still feel, respect in this case for Jehovah's Witnesses. And I could trust that man because I knew something of his goodness and of his integrity, but I didn't feel I could trust him on religious matters at least concerning the identity of Jesus. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
In the area concerning salvation, I was less trusting. In areas concerning, can I trust this man to take care of me if we're climbing a mountain together?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You could trust in the moment of if you're in a war, in a foxhole with a soldier who happens to have a different worldview than you, that you're fighting for a common cause, or that you can depend upon that individual. I believe that's
you can respect
reasonable,
him and you can trust him.
Yeah, I can respect him, and I'm going to trust him, and I'm going to work with him. But like you said, there's a distinction between, I almost look at this word as tolerance is a good thing, but tolerance can be a bad thing.
Tolerance run amok.
Yeah, run amok. I mean, we have to be able to ascribe discernment, or use discernment to distinguish between where a person is trustworthy, where they're not trustworthy, where it's right to respect them and where it's not right to respect them. You wouldn't holistically disrespect an atheist, but you might disrespect their lack of belief in a deity. You would certainly not say, I respect that man's worldview about God not existing. I would not.
I might begin to disrespect him if in his attempt to put forward his point of view enthusiastically, which I do not deny him.
Yeah.
He spent much of his time belittling
and degrading
believers.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
And so that would cause you disrespect.
I would feel the same way toward a person who's a massive believer who is trying to embarrass or belittle someone who is not.
In just the same way, as we use these two terms, trust and respect, I think there's a place that you can respect a person of a different worldview, and there's a place where you would choose to disrespect, as you just pointed out. I think also there's a place to trust and not to trust. I would not trust my life, my safety, to a person who I thought their worldview would be destructive or hurtful to my family. I would not stay at the home of somebody who I thought had in their worldview the possibility that you could have relations with children. I would not trust that person or rely upon their respect of me. It's always going to come back to a point of discernment, as in the interfaith dialogue world, that we want to start with respect. We certainly want to offer that. We certainly want to offer trust, and realize there's a practical reality of common cause and common humanity. But when that sense of trust or sense of respect is violated by actions that are not consistent with common cause and common grace, that we have to be wise about that.
I just finished, as I mentioned to you, a third biography. I've been obsessed with this, of John Wesley. And I hadn't realized just how close John Wesley and George Whitefield were. Very dear, close friends within Methodism. Both Methodists, as it were, not a church yet, but still a movement, a society.
Right, they were a society.
A society. And what made that even more fascinating a friendship is Whitefield was very, very Calvinistic and very strong on predestination. And Wesley was against anything of the sort, and yet the love.
Isn't that impressive? That's impressive when we see that
for one another.
Yeah.
Was I mean they couldn't get together often enough to express that love for one another, because if with them their common belief was salvation is in Christ.
Isn't it interesting? In the same way, some people look at our relationship and they hear about it and they see it, or they come to a dialogue presentation that we do, and they assume that the kind of friendly nature of our interaction, the experiences, the banter, the humor, the good nature of our relationship is an immediate evidence of compromise. There's no way.
Or shallowness.
Well, more so, I think, a sense of compromise. That there's no way that we could get along this well and not be more intentional with one another, because obviously, if we were really doing truthful interaction with one another, we couldn't share this kind of a relationship. Just on the flip side, some people have felt that our lack of I kind of lost my thought there. Kind of that, on the one hand, our relationship speaks to compromise. On the other hand, the tremendous amount of appreciation and respect and how impressed people have been that even though we hold these different worldviews, even though we've been honest about that, even though we've shared it, that you still show such respect for each other, that you're obviously such good friends. So I do think what you're saying there is true there, is that the fact that people of different worldviews can learn to respect one another, to be gracious, to be respectful, is a key part of the interfaith dialogue experience.
Agreed.
I'm going to follow up on that question, or comment, Greg. The day is waning, and I don't want to keep you here all night. What would you want to see, and same question for you, Bob. What would you want to see most changed in Mormonism? One of my studies was of an Episcopalian bishop who had a strategy back in the late 1800s and early 1900s in Utah of converting the Mormons in their pews, just getting them to tweak a few things, and then they could join the denominations of Christianity and he wouldn't have any worry about their souls. He was worried deeply about their souls, by the way, and that change needed to occur. I give that as a context. If you wouldn't mind playing the game for a moment, his name was Spalding. With a Spalding's view, what do you seriously think Mormons need to change? Where are they very dangerous in their beliefs, both for themselves and for the world maybe generally? And then think about that same question with respect to your dialogue partner here. Try to be as... it's obvious you're friendly. Try to be critical for a minute.
There's nothing he can say at this point.
I could synthesize it into two primary concerns, and it would have to be. It's such a concern for me that I would long for it to be something publicly affirmed, something clearly stated, something clearly taught from the highest level of authority in the Mormon faith. To be persuaded that Mormonism as a whole is really there, as opposed to individual relationships of individual Mormons that have said certain things. That's wonderful.
This is where the church is.
I'm answering this question from the holistic perspective. That I long to see, and I'm deeply concerned until I do, a clear statement that we are saved by the grace of Jesus Christ alone. I'm deeply saddened that too many Latter-day Saints feel it's a combination, that it's a works plus grace deal. And the irony is I don't think this is an impossible thing. I mean, clearly I read the Book of Mormon and I get enough clarity on grace that any evangelical I could ever encourage to read the Book of Mormon would say, if Mormons believed this, as this is stated, their view of Christian salvation would be like mine. It's my own experience, and it's my conversations post-leaving Mormonism with too many Latter-day Saints who really do believe that it's a best effort plus what Jesus did equals exaltation or salvation. So a clear church-wide embracement, not an abandonment of discipleship, not an abandonment of duty and faithfulness and the concepts of obedience, not an abandonment of that, but a clear definition, a clear affirmation of the doctrine of sola grasola, the grace alone.
From my perspective, that would not require much of a change in lifestyle.
It would not
require a change of worldview. It would require a change of perspective.
Yeah, and it's not, I humbly believe, without feeling like I have the authority to tell the LDS Church to do anything, I don't believe it's an impossible, jump. The second, I think, is a more challenging reality. And again, I think I can be fairly succinct. The Mormon view of God's being is complicated. Not just a Nicene view of Trinity versus a Mormon view of Godhead. I think that's less of a challenge than the larger question of what comes out of King Follett. The idea that God was a man who became an exalted being, and that human beings have the potential. Now, I can take great encouragement from something as recent as within the life of Gordon B. Hinckley, that is a doctrine that is not being taught, that is not being emphasized. Surely he understands the philosophical nature of the question when asked by the Time reporter, but he doesn't know a whole lot about it, and I don't know who does. I can take great comfort in conversations we've had with evangelical and Mormon scholars about King Follett, all the dynamics of when it was preached, at what time it was preached, the lack of clarity and coherency around it, the lack of strong teaching about it, conference after conference. But it would be a thrilling thing for me and an essential thing for me, in my humblest of way of putting it, that Mormonism would have to define itself, in order to be embraced as a fellow Christian faith, would have to redefine its doctrine on God, that God is uniquely God, that He has always been God, and that human beings are not going to become, in the sense of being, like Him, God-like, or gods, if you will. Like Jesus, like God in character and attributes, absolutely. But we need to keep the creator-creature distinction alive, because God is God and I am not, and He will not share His glory with another. He cannot be equal to anyone else. My view of God, my sense of His exaltedness, His holiness, His otherness, His extremeness, His wonder is beyond anything that the humans could attain or become like. And I think that is an attempt to bring honor and glory to His name, not to be down on humanity, because He is the creator, we are the creature. So it's in those two bigger... I think if there... The first thing, as you said, in so many ways seems, maybe even within the last 10 years, seems so possible that kind of declaration could be made with a strong commitment to the call of duty and discipleship and faithfulness and moral lifestyle, without ever weakening that. But a strong sense that we have to remember we're saved by grace alone. I'm hearing that. I see it in the Book of Mormon. I long for that to be, and I don't see that as far off as possible. The other one's tougher for me, because I think that's deeply embedded into the view of Mormon theology. And yet, if that's the God, if that's who God is, that's a different God than I understand Him to be.
Okay. My turn?
Yes.
The pendulum tends to swing. And as I look at the history of evangelicalism, I see a swing, obviously, away from fundamentalism to create the neo-evangelicals, as they were called, now the evangelicals. The great worries I have for evangelicalism, or what I would want for evangelicalism, I would say as follows. I have great concerns that the lack of if I were Catholic, I'd say a priestly hierarchy. As a Latter-day Saint, I would say a priesthood organization. I believe the lack of that contributes to a growing dissemination, a growing compartmentalization, a growing pulling apart of that evangelical world, so that I would fear that within the next 20 years it will be hard to tell who is and who is not evangelical, and what constitutes the true evangelical. With such thing, I fear, for example, that one of the great things that I don't want to see happen is Luther's concept of every man his own interpreter. That sounds so liberating, so enlightening, and yet it is so worrisome when truly everybody is their own interpreter. In other words, when my perspective on that scripture is worth just as much as my pastor's, and just as much as the president of the Evangelical Theological Society, I fear that without some sort of more firm, solid, rigid organization, that fragmentation will continue. I fear also that, and I expressed this to you when we were there, I fear that a greater, that I fear that either the growth of the megachurch or the growth of the emergent church will have, unless serious corrections are made, will have a major diluting effect upon doctrine.